Hello and welcome. I am Yogesh Pai, Assistant Professor of Law at National Law University, Delhi. I am pleased to be part of this course on intellectual property. I am your paper coordinator for the MOOCs platform. In this week, we are going to study the foundations of intellectual property law. This week consists of 4 modules, primarily intellectual property law, a kind of introduction and a primer. Second, universal origins of intellectual property. Third, theoretical justifications of intellectual property law. And fourth, the economic dimensions of intellectual property. Now, in the intellectual property as a primer, we are going to study why different categories of intellectual property exist as a matter of fact. And you have various statutes that cover intellectual property. In this particular paper, you are going to study how the intellectual property regime is structured as a property right, what is its time duration, why such things exist, what are the difference between various categories of intellectual property, including what are the foundational pillars of intellectual property. I would also briefly introduce you to other modules throughout the rest of the course, since this is the first module that looks into the primer or gives a kind of broader approach to the discussions that are going to be pursued in the next 41 modules. The second module by Vishwas Devaiah is on universal origins of intellectual property law. Intellectual property law has a fascinating history, and if you look through how it has evolved in UK, in Europe, in the US, and finally in India, you would understand that a lot of debates that you think about intellectual property are new are actually not new. The difference and distinctions between ideas and innovation markets vis-a-vis the goods market have been historical, and the kind of competing interest that intellectual property has played can be seen from the historical tensions built in the intellectual property system. The third module consists of a theoretical justifications for intellectual property. Again, Dr. Vishwas Devaiah is going to look into what justifies intellectual property from a normative perspective. There are various theories that today are argued to present intellectual property and understand intellectual property as a property right, primarily being the labor theory and other kinds of utilitarian justifications and some other non-utilitarian justifications for intellectual property law. There are theories that can be easily at some times be applied to intellectual property, and in some other cases the theories that were developed to justify property rights in the non-intellectual property context would find a greater level of difficulty in being applied to intellectual property. The fourth and the final module for this week deals with economic underpinnings of intellectual property law. Swaraj Paul Barua is going to take you through the various economic dimensions of intellectual property law. In fact, if there is something that closely resembles a kind of property right in the real world and in its intangible form in the intellectual property system, there are deeper economic issues that need to be studied and as to what these differences are and how those could be accounted for the economics of intellectual property, precisely because knowledge or information is a public good which has both non-rivalrous and non-excludable characteristics. Finally, after this discussion, I will again come back to you after the conclusion of these 4 modules to find out what you have studied in these through the week. Thank you very much.